The funeral of Daniel Whitfield was, by every visible measure, a beautiful service. 200 people, St. Andrew's Church on the hill, the one with the old stone walls and the stained glass that turned the morning light gold. White lilies on the casket. A string quartet. The kind of funeral that costs a great deal of money and says, to everyone attending, that the deceased was a person of significance. His wife, Sandra, stood in the front row in a black dress that fit perfectly, her hand resting on the arm of Daniel's brother, Marcus, who stood beside her with the particular composure of a man managing his grief with considerable success. Sandra was not crying. People noticed this. They noticed it the way people notice things at funerals, quietly, with the uncomfortable awareness that noticing feels unkind, but the observation exists regardless. She wasn't cold. She was composed. She received the handshakes and the condolences with the steady warmth of someone who had prepared for this day and was managing it well. She was managing it very well. The pastor had reached the committal. The casket was about to be moved to the cemetery, and then the doors of St. Andrew's Church swung open, not gently, with the specific force of someone who has been waiting and is done waiting. The congregation turned, and Daniel Whitfield, whose body was supposedly in the casket at the front of that church, whose death certificate had been filed 4 days ago, whose estate was already being discussed in quiet corners, walked through those doors and down the center aisle of his own funeral. He was not a ghost. He was not an apparition. He was a living man in a dark suit, and he was looking at the front of the church with the expression of someone who has driven a very long way to have a single, final, entirely necessary conversation. Sandra's hand dropped from Marcus's arm. The church went so silent that the sound of Daniel's footsteps on the stone floor was the only sound in the building. And what happened in the next 12 minutes was recorded on 7 hidden cameras and broadcast live to 48,000 people who were watching a live stream that Sandra herself had arranged to share the funeral with relatives who couldn't attend. She had arranged her own exposure. Let me tell you how we got here. Like this video right now. That like button is what gets this story in front of the people who need to see it. Hit it. Subscribe if you haven't. It's completely free. Drop a comment and tell me where in the world you're watching from. Now let me take you back 3 weeks. Daniel Whitfield was 48 years old and had built Whitfield Capital from a mid-sized regional investment firm into one of the most respected private equity groups in the Southeast. He had done this through a combination of genuine intelligence, relentless discipline, and the specific quality that the best business minds share, an ability to see what was actually happening rather than what people were presenting to him. He was good at reading rooms. He was good at reading people. He had built a career on not being fooled. He had been fooled by the 2 people closest to him for approximately 3 years. He discovered this on a Tuesday evening in September when he came home from a business trip 48 hours early and found his brother Marcus's car in the driveway of his house. Marcus lived 40 minutes away. Marcus had no standing reason to be at Daniel's house when Daniel was traveling, and Daniel's wife Sandra was home alone. But it was his brother's car. He knew the plates, a specific dent on the rear left panel from a parking incident 2 years ago, and he had sat in his own driveway for a moment before going inside. Sandra had explained it simply and immediately. Marcus had come by to drop something off. He had stayed for dinner because it was late. She had the warmth and the ease of someone telling a completely benign truth, which was one of the things that had always made her extraordinary to be around, and which Daniel now understood from a different angle. He had said, of course, he had had dinner with both of them. He had watched them in the specific way of a man who has seen something that rearranged his model, but has not yet decided what to do with the rearrangement. He had said nothing. He had started paying attention. Sandra Whitfield, née Carol, was 43, and had been, from the outside, an exceptional partner for a man of Daniel's profile. She was intelligent, socially skilled, genuinely beautiful in a way that still turned heads, and had spent 12 years being exactly what Daniel's world required, present at the right events, warm to the right people, capable enough in conversation to hold her own, and careful enough to let Daniel lead. She had married him at 31. She had been, as far as Daniel understood at the time, in love with him. She had also been, he understood now, pragmatic in a way that had its own kind of discipline. Sandra made decisions about what she needed, and then moved toward those things with the patience of someone who understood that the right outcome required the right timing. What she needed from Daniel was money. What she had decided she actually wanted was a different life, and the person she had decided she wanted to build it with was Marcus. Marcus Whitfield was 45, 3 years older than Daniel, and had grown up in the specific shadow of a younger brother who excelled with a completeness that was impossible to resent directly, because it had never been held over him, but which had built in Marcus a quiet, persistent understanding of his own secondary position in the world. He loved his brother. That was the honest, terrible thing about it. He loved Daniel in the way people love the version of someone they believe they deserve to be, instead of the version they actually became. And that love had curdled, slowly, over decades, into something that wore love's face but operated entirely differently underneath it. He and Sandra had begun their affair 3 years ago. They had also, in the past 6 months, begun a different conversation. Daniel was not by nature a man who went through other people's things. He had been raised to believe that privacy was a form of respect, and he had extended this belief to his marriage with the same consistency he brought to his professional commitments. He had never looked through Sandra's phone. He had never questioned her expenses beyond the normal shared visibility of a joint account. He had given her the privacy of someone he trusted. He had spent 2 weeks after the driveway moment watching, rather than searching. Then, on a Saturday when Sandra was at a spa appointment and he had the house to himself, he sat at his desk and began doing what he was actually very good at, following the money. The estate would have been the mechanism. Daniel's estate was structured around a trust that would, upon his death, flow primarily to Sandra and, in smaller portions, to charitable organizations and to Marcus. Sandra as primary beneficiary was standard. She was his wife. What was not standard, what he found when he looked at the documentation his attorney had filed 6 months ago, was that someone had requested a copy of the full trust structure, including the specific disbursement timeline. The request had come through his estate attorney's office. The person who had made the inquiry, using a procedurally legitimate but personally unauthorized approach, had been Marcus, who, as a named beneficiary, had just enough access to request general information and had pushed that access further than he should have. Daniel looked at this for a long time. Then he called a private investigator named Carl Briggs, who came highly recommended, and who, over the following 10 days, produced documentation that Daniel read in his office alone on a Thursday afternoon with the door closed. The documentation covered 3 years. It covered the affair. It covered a series of financial conversations between Sandra and Marcus, in which the word inheritance appeared 11 times across various communications. It covered a meeting, 3 weeks ago, at a downtown hotel, in which Sandra and Marcus had met with a man who turned out to be a financial consultant who specialized in estate liquidity, the specific process of converting inherited assets into accessible cash quickly after a beneficiary event. Daniel sat with the documentation for 2 hours. He thought about his mother, who had died 6 years ago and whose life's work, an orphanage she had established and funded for 30 years, had been placed in his care and maintained by his estate. He thought about the orphanage. He thought about what would happen to it if the estate went where Sandra and Marcus planned. Then he called 3 people, his attorney, his closest friend and business partner Tom, and a private security consultant named Howard, whose firm specialized in something Daniel had never previously had reason to require. He told them what he had found. He told them what he wanted to do. Tom said, "Daniel, this is extraordinary. Are you sure?" Daniel said, "I'm sure." Howard said, "We can make it work, but it has to be precise." "I know," Daniel said. "Make it precise." The staged accident was genuine in its execution and false in its outcome. Daniel's car went off a rain-slicked road on a Tuesday night. The accident was real. Howard's team had choreographed it with the kind of technical precision that meant the vehicle damage was consistent with a serious crash, and Daniel walked away with a bruised shoulder and a cut above his eyebrow that didn't require stitches. The body that was reported at the scene was documented through a combination of witness management and official misdirection that Howard's team had assembled with meticulous care. The death certificate was a legal instrument that took Daniel's attorney into territory he had never previously navigated, and which had required careful consultation with specific legal specialists. The casket at St. Andrews was empty. Sandra had been notified. She had cried. Daniel had been told she cried, which he sat with. She had organized the funeral with the efficiency of someone who had been doing a kind of preparation for this that she hadn't named even to herself. She had arranged the live stream for the family members who couldn't attend. She had called Marcus first, before she called anyone else. Daniel knew this because Howard had been watching. Marcus had arrived at Sandra's house 45 minutes after the call. He had stayed for 6 hours. 2 days later, Sandra's attorney had filed a formal notification of intent to claim the estate. The casket had been closed throughout the service because Daniel's attorney had filed the death certificate on the basis that the body was not in a condition suitable for viewing. A procedural explanation that nobody had questioned, because procedural explanations at funerals are rarely questioned by grieving people. Sandra had not questioned it. She had pressed her hand to the casket lid at the start of the service and held it there for a moment. The hidden cameras had filmed this. Like this video right now. We are at the moment everything is about to happen, and that like button is right there. Hit it. Subscribe if you haven't. Drop your location in the comments. Where are you watching from? Now let's get to the moment the doors open. Daniel had positioned himself outside St. Andrew's Church throughout the service. He could hear the organ through the stone walls. He could see the live stream. Tom had access to the feed on his phone and sent periodic updates. He had stood in the cold morning in his dark suit and listened to his own funeral and felt something he hadn't anticipated. Grief, not for himself, for the version of his marriage he had believed in for 12 years, for the brother he had trusted, for the people in that church who were genuinely mourning, who had known him and cared for him, and were sitting in those pews with real sadness. He had given himself the full length of the service. Then, when Tom's message read, "Pastor has begun committal," Daniel had nodded to Howard, who was standing 10 feet away. He had walked to the doors. He had pushed them open. The church turned all at once, the way congregations turn when something happens that overrides the directed attention of a formal service. Daniel walked down the center aisle of St. Andrew's Church. He did not hurry. He did not run. He walked with the specific, deliberate pace of someone who has spent 3 weeks waiting for this moment and is giving it the space it deserves. People near the aisle leaned back slightly, not in fear, in the specific involuntary response of people encountering something that their brain is not quite processing. Someone near the back said, "Oh my God." Someone else said his name. At the front of the church, Sandra had risen from her seat. Marcus had not moved. He was standing very still in the way that people stand when their body has received information that the mind hasn't yet decided how to handle. Daniel walked to the front of the church. He stopped at the casket, his casket, the empty one with the white lilies. He placed his hand briefly on the lid. Then he looked up. He looked at Sandra. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the congregation of 200 people who had come to mourn him. "I'm sorry for the theatrics," he said. His voice was calm and carried clearly in the stone acoustics of the church. "I needed to be certain before I ended this. I'm certain now." Sandra found her voice. "Daniel, it came out wrong, too small, the wrong kind of surprise. Not the surprise of someone encountering a miracle, but the surprise of someone whose plan has failed in a way they cannot yet calculate." "Don't," he said, not unkindly, simply. He turned to face the congregation. "My name is Daniel Whitfield," he said. "Most of you know that. You came here because you were told I had died, and I appreciate your presence more than I can say. The truth is that I staged this in order to confirm something that I could not confirm any other way." He paused. "The people standing beside my casket, my wife and my brother, have been planning for at least 6 months to inherit my estate through means that would have required me to not be here." The church made a sound. Not a gasp, something more complex. The collective noise of 200 people processing something simultaneously. "I'm here," Daniel said, "and everything that has happened in this building this morning has been recorded." He nodded to Tom, who was standing at the side of the church. The flat screen that Sandra had arranged to display memorial photographs, a loving gesture she had organized for the live stream, switched to security footage. Not the funeral, not today. Footage from 3 weeks ago. Sandra and Marcus at the downtown hotel. The meeting with the financial consultant. Marcus's hands on the table, Sandra leaning forward, the consultant's documents spread between them. No audio, just the image, clear, dated, time-stamped. Then a second clip. Sandra on the phone, 2 days after the staged accident, her expression during the call, the way she pressed her hand flat on the kitchen counter and exhaled when it was over. Not grief, relief. The church saw it. 200 people who had known Daniel and Sandra and Marcus for years saw it. Marcus spoke first. "Daniel, you need to understand. I understand," Daniel said. "I've understood for 3 weeks. I needed you to be here so that the understanding could be shared properly." Sandra said nothing. Her attorney, sitting 3 rows back, was already on his phone. Daniel's attorney was already on his. The live stream had 48,000 viewers by the time Daniel began speaking. Sandra had promoted it. She had sent the link to family members across 3 states, to friends, to the broader social network of a woman who had spent 12 years building the kind of public life that an inheritance required protecting. She had wanted witnesses to her grief. She had gotten witnesses. The clip of Daniel walking through those church doors and what followed was shared 300,000 times before the end of the day. By the following morning, it was the subject of national coverage. The legal process moved quickly because Daniel's preparation had been thorough. His attorney had been ready with the documentation before the funeral, the private investigator's report, the hotel meeting footage, the estate filing Sandra had made, Marcus's unauthorized inquiry into the trust structure. The estate claim Sandra had filed was challenged and dismissed within 2 weeks. The divorce was initiated by Daniel. The criminal investigation, opened by the district attorney's office, which had watched the same live stream as everyone else, and then requested a meeting with Daniel's attorney, moved on a separate, slower track with the specific patience of a process that was building something airtight. Daniel said nothing publicly about the investigation. He said nothing publicly about Sandra or Marcus. He made one statement, through his attorney, that simply confirmed he was alive and that legal matters were ongoing. He also made one announcement that was not through his attorney. He went to the orphanage on a Thursday morning. His mother had established it 32 years ago, in a neighborhood that had not then and still did not have many resources, and she had funded it through her own estate and through a network of donors she had cultivated with the same patience and consistency she had brought to everything in her life. Daniel had maintained it since her death. He had also, in the 3 weeks of his stage death, had occasion to think very carefully about what he wanted to do with the rest of his life and his money. He met with the orphanage director, a woman named Patricia, who had been there for 20 years and who received Daniel in her small office with the particular composure of someone who had seen many things and was not easily rattled. "I want to establish a permanent endowment," Daniel said, "enough to fund operations for the next 50 years without dependence on annual fundraising." Patricia looked at him. "That would be," she stopped. "Mr. Whitfield, the amount that would require." "I know the amount," he said. "I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks." He paused. "My mother spent 30 years building something that mattered. I spent 12 years next to people who didn't know what mattered. I'd like to correct that." Patricia looked at him for a long time. "Your mother used to say," she said carefully, "that the children here needed to know that someone would always be there, that it wasn't conditional." "I know," Daniel said. "She told me that too." "The endowment would mean that," Patricia said. "Yes," he said, "that's the point. Marcus did not go to prison. The criminal investigation produced charges of conspiracy and fraud that were resolved through a plea agreement 18 months later that included restitution and probation, and the specific, permanent marking of a criminal record. Daniel did not attend any of the proceedings. He had said what he needed to say in St. Andrew's Church in front of 200 people and 48,000 livestream viewers, and he did not need to say it again. Sandra's divorce was finalized at 10 months. She received what the prenuptial agreement, signed 12 years ago, at the insistence of Daniel's attorney and reluctantly accepted by Sandra's, entitled her to. It was not nothing. It was also not what she had planned. She moved to a different city. She did not maintain contact with Marcus. The orphanage endowment was announced publicly on a Sunday morning in February, almost exactly 6 months after the funeral. The announcement was made at the orphanage itself, not at a gala, not at a press event, at a Sunday breakfast that the children had every week, that staff and some regular volunteers attended, that had been happening in that building for 32 years. Daniel stood at the front of the room and said that his mother had built something that was going to last, and that it was going to last because it was now funded in a way that didn't depend on the kindness of any one person continuing to make that choice. He said the endowment was being established in his mother's name. He said he hoped the children who came through this place over the next 50 years would feel, in the specific way he had felt when he was young and his mother had talked about the work, that someone had decided they were worth an unconditional commitment. A 7-year-old girl in the front row raised her hand. Daniel looked at her. "Are you the man who came back from the dead?" she said. The room laughed, the real kind, warm and startled. "Something like that," Daniel said. She considered this. "That's cool," she said. Daniel laughed, the first fully real laugh he had produced in about 3 months. "Yeah," he said. "I think it worked out." Daniel Whitfield faked his death to expose people who were planning to use that death to take everything he had built. He could have gone to the police. He could have filed the documentation and initiated the legal process and let the system run its course without the funeral, without the church, without the cameras and the live stream, and the moment his wife's relief was visible to 48,000 people. He chose the funeral instead. He chose the room full of witnesses. He chose to let Sandra's own livestream become the instrument of her exposure. He chose to walk through those doors himself, in person, and look them both in the face with the full weight of what they had tried to do. Was that justice? Or was it something more personal than justice? The need for witnesses, for the truth to be seen rather than just adjudicated. Here is the question. Was Daniel right to stage it the way he did? The legal process would have served him just as well. But without the church, without the moment, without the 48,000 people, did he need that moment? And if you were in his position, would you have done the same thing? Or would you have just let the lawyers handle it quietly? Drop your answer, real ones only, and tell me where you're watching from. Like this video. If Daniel's story delivered for you, that like button is right there and it means something. Hit it. Share this with someone. Subscribe if you're not already. You've been here 12 minutes, you clearly belong here. See you in the next one.